For thousands of years, rain wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a constant test of intelligence, teamwork, and preparation. Every storm challenged ancient people to think ahead, adapt quickly, and rely on skills that determined whether they would see another sunrise. Their survival wasn't built on luck, it was built on knowledge refined over countless generations. One of the greatest advantages ancient communities possessed was their extraordinary ability to understand the world around them. They didn't wait for dark clouds to arrive before reacting. They recognized subtle warnings hidden throughout nature long before the first drop of rain ever fell. The scent of damp earth rising before a storm, birds suddenly flying lower than usual, insects changing their patterns, animals quietly moving toward higher ground, shifting winds, changing cloud formations, even the behavior of rivers and ponds all served as reliable signals. These weren't mysterious superstitions, they were observations repeated so often that they became second nature. Modern people read notifications on a phone. Ancient people read the landscape itself. That kind of awareness reminds us that paying attention is a skill worth protecting. The more closely we observe our surroundings, the more connected we become to the world, instead of simply passing through it. Nature has always been speaking. Most of us have simply stopped listening. Comment 2. If you think we've lost more natural awareness than we realize. Because they recognized weather hours before it arrived, ancient groups could make smart decisions while there was still time. They moved towards safer ground, gathered additional firewood, reinforced shelters, and prepared food before heavy rain made every task more difficult. Preparation wasn't driven by fear, it was simply part of everyday life. Anthropologists studying indigenous communities today continue to find remarkable environmental knowledge that often surprises researchers. Experienced trackers can read footprints, animal behavior, vegetation, and weather conditions simultaneously, making surprisingly accurate predictions about what the next several hours will bring. What appears extraordinary to us was simply daily experience to them. Weather awareness wasn't magic. It was expertise developed through years of observation and passed carefully from one generation to the next. Choosing where to camp was just as important as predicting the weather itself. Ancient humans understood that survival often depended less on building a shelter and more on selecting the right location before construction even began. A small rise in elevation could mean sleeping comfortably instead of waking in freezing water. Cold air naturally settles into valleys, while higher ground remains drier and warmer during rainy nights. That simple difference could save lives. South-facing hillsides in the northern hemisphere dried more quickly because they received more sunlight. Thick forests intercepted much of the rainfall before it ever reached the ground, making them valuable natural shelters. Rock overhangs provided ready-made protection that reduced construction time and preserved valuable energy. The landscape itself became part of every shelter they built. There's an important lesson hidden here. Sometimes success isn't about working harder. It's about choosing a better starting point. A wise decision made early often saves countless problems later. Over generations, families return to the same reliable campsites again and again. Archaeological sites reveal repeated layers of ashes, tools, animal bones, and fireplaces built in exactly the same locations for thousands of years. Those places earned their reputation because they consistently offered safety during difficult weather. Knowledge of the land became one of humanity's most valuable inheritances. Ancient people also possessed bodies that responded differently to cold and wet conditions than most modern people do today. Their strength wasn't the result of superhuman genetics alone, it came from constant exposure. Today, many people experience cold only briefly before stepping into a heated room. Ancient humans had no thermostat waiting nearby. Their bodies learned to function through continual adaptation. Modern research on cold exposure shows that repeated contact with low temperatures gradually reduces the body's shock response. Breathing becomes more controlled, circulation adapts more efficiently, and the body handles cold stress with greater confidence. Ancient humans experienced this adaptation naturally throughout their lives. Their toughness wasn't mysterious, it was trained into them every single day. This reminds us that comfort and resilience often move in opposite directions. Growth usually happens when we experience manageable challenges rather than avoiding every discomfort. Researchers have also discovered differences in metabolism among populations that have lived in cold climates for thousands of years. Many show higher resting metabolic rates and greater activity of brown fat, a special type of body fat that produces heat instead of storing energy. Some of these traits develop genetically across many generations, while others appear through repeated environmental exposure. In other words, the human body remains remarkably adaptable whenever conditions demand it. Ancient people weren't simply enduring nature, their bodies were continuously responding to it. Around this point, it's worth recognizing something easy to overlook. Rain shaped not only human behavior, but also human biology. Every generation that successfully adapted passed valuable advantages to the next, making survival gradually more efficient. Comment 1. If this changes the way you think about human evolution. But perhaps the greatest survival tool wasn't fire, shelter, or even physical endurance. It was community. Facing endless rain alone was incredibly difficult. Facing it together transformed an impossible challenge into a manageable one. People slept close together beneath shared shelters, conserving precious body heat throughout the night. The warmest place wasn't determined by status, it was determined by simple physics. Those surrounded by others retained heat far more effectively than anyone isolated on the edge. Privacy was far less important than survival. Every member of the group contributed according to ability. Younger individuals collected wood and repaired shelters. Experienced elders decided when to travel, where to camp, and how to respond to changing conditions. Children remained protected, near the center of the group where warmth and safety were greatest. The community itself functioned almost like one living organism. This reminds us that independence has limits. Human history was built not by individuals standing alone, but by people learning how to depend on one another when circumstances became overwhelming. Knowledge was equally valuable. Fire-carrying methods, waterproofing techniques, seasonal migration routes, weather prediction, edible plants, slow-burning tree bark, and countless practical skills weren't rediscovered every generation. They were carefully taught. Older members of the community represented living libraries. When an elder died, the group lost far more than another pair of hands. It lost decades of experience that couldn't be replaced overnight. Archaeological evidence even suggests that many ancient communities cared for elderly individuals long after they could no longer hunt or gather efficiently. Keeping them alive wasn't simply compassion. It was one of the smartest survival investments a community could make. That respect for experience carries an important message today. Information can be written down, but wisdom usually lives inside people. Listening to those who've walked difficult paths often saves us from repeating unnecessary mistakes. Rain also transformed the way ancient people found and managed food. Hunger didn't disappear simply because storms arrived. In fact, long periods of rain often made finding enough calories even more difficult. Heavy rainfall pushed many animals into hiding, making hunting less predictable. Familiar food sources became buried beneath mud or soaked beyond immediate use. Even cooking became more complicated because keeping a fire burning required constant attention. Cold weather increased the body's energy needs at exactly the same time food became harder to obtain. To overcome this problem, ancient communities planned far in advance. Archaeological discoveries reveal evidence of stored nuts, dried meat, smoked fish, and preserved foods hidden in cool underground caches or elevated storage areas protected from moisture. These supplies weren't emergency miracles, they were the result of careful planning. Saving food for tomorrow requires believing that tomorrow matters. That simple act reflects optimism, patience, and trust in the future. Civilization often begins long before cities appear. It begins when people prepare for challenges they haven't faced yet. Rain also changed what people chose to eat. Instead of fighting against nature, they adapted to what the season naturally provided. After heavy rainfall, earthworms surfaced in enormous numbers. Flooded rivers created ideal fishing opportunities. Mushrooms and fungi appeared throughout damp forests. Snails, frogs, insects, and other moisture-loving creatures became far easier to collect than during dry seasons. Rather than insisting on one familiar menu, ancient people adjusted their diets according to changing conditions. Flexibility became one of humanity's greatest survival advantages. That lesson still applies today. The strongest people aren't always those who resist change. They're often the ones who recognize opportunity hidden inside changing circumstances. Comment 0 if you've ever discovered that adapting turned out better than sticking to the original plan. Food was rarely treated as private property during difficult seasons. Hunter-gatherer societies around the world consistently demonstrate strong traditions of sharing resources. When food became scarce, communities distributed what they had instead of allowing a few individuals to accumulate everything. A single person eating well while everyone else starved weakened the entire group. Shared survival created stronger communities than individual success ever could. Cooperation wasn't simply a moral value, it was a practical strategy that dramatically increased everyone's chances of surviving until better conditions returned. When we step back and examine where ancient humans actually chose to settle, another remarkable pattern appears. They didn't avoid rainy regions. Instead, they repeatedly moved into some of the wettest environments on Earth. Dense rainforests, floodplains, coastal forests, monsoon regions, river valleys, and subarctic landscapes all became home to human communities, despite the constant challenges those places presented. Why? Because rain also created abundance. Water nourished forests rich with edible plants. Rivers overflowed with fish. Wetlands supported birds, amphibians, and countless other food sources. Moist environments produced extraordinary biodiversity compared with dry landscapes. Ancient people accepted the hardships because the rewards outweighed the risks. Rain represented both danger and opportunity. That's an inspiring perspective to remember. Many of life's greatest opportunities arrive wrapped inside inconvenience. The challenge often hides the very resource we're searching for. Modern society often treats rain as something that ruins schedules, delays travel, or interrupts entertainment. Ancient humans saw something entirely different. Rain wasn't an interruption. It was simply another condition of life that demanded preparation, skill, and respect. Every waterproof hide, carefully protected ember, angled roof, elevated campsite, preserved food cache, and shared shelter reflected thousands of years of accumulated experience. None of those solutions appeared overnight. Each represented countless observations, experiments, failures, and improvements made by generations who refused to surrender to difficult conditions. When viewed together, they reveal something extraordinary. Ancient humans didn't merely survive harsh weather, they built entire systems of knowledge designed specifically to master it. Long before modern engineering, weather forecasting, insulated buildings, or waterproof fabrics existed, our ancestors had already developed practical technologies perfectly suited to the environments they inhabited. Their achievements deserve far more admiration than they usually receive. Today, we benefit from waterproof clothing, central heating, weather satellites, drainage systems, and insulated homes. Yet every one of those modern conveniences traces its origins back to someone long ago who spent a freezing, rain-soaked night solving a problem with nothing more than observation, creativity, patience, and determination. Someone discovered that smoke helped preserve shelters. Someone realized certain animal fats naturally resisted water Someone noticed which branches shed rain most effectively. Someone learned where water always flowed after storms. Someone figured out that staying close together through the night dramatically increased everyone's chances of surviving until morning. Those discoveries became the first chapters of human engineering. Every modern solution stands upon foundations built by people who possessed neither machines nor textbooks, only careful attention to the natural world and an unwavering determination to adapt. Perhaps that's the greatest lesson ancient rain survival leaves us. Human progress has never been driven by comfort alone. It has always grown from curiosity, cooperation, resilience, and the willingness to learn from every challenge nature places in our path. The next time rain taps against your window, it may be worth remembering that countless generations before us faced the very same sound without electricity, insulated walls, or weather forecasts. They endured, they learned, they passed those lessons forward, and because they did, every generation that followed inherited a world filled with the knowledge their perseverance made possible.